Sarah Mitchell's day started like any other Tuesday morning in Chicago. The sun was just rising over the city skyline as she pulled out of her luxury apartment building's parking garage in her well-maintained black Mercedes. She had spent extra time that morning making sure she looked perfect. Her dark blue designer suit was pressed, her natural hair was neatly styled, and her makeup was flawless. As a senior corporate lawyer at one of Chicago's top law firms, she knew the importance of appearance. The clock on her dashboard showed 7:45 a.m. She was right on schedule for her 8:30 a.m. meeting with an important client. Sarah had prepared for this meeting all week, and the documents she needed were neatly organized in her leather briefcase on the passenger seat. The morning traffic was light, and the weather was clear. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. As she drove through the quiet suburban streets that led to the main highway, Sarah noticed a police car parked near a corner. She didn't think much of it. She was following all traffic rules, as she always did. Just as she passed through the intersection, red and blue lights started flashing in her rearview mirror. Sarah's heart rate increased slightly, but she remained calm. She had been through this before. Following proper procedure, she turned on her right signal and pulled over to a safe spot by the curb. Her hands went to the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, and she waited patiently. Through her side mirror, she watched as Officer James Cooper approached her car. He was a middle-aged white man with a serious expression on his face. "License and registration," Officer Cooper demanded, not bothering with a greeting. His tone was harsh, and his hand rested on his belt near his weapon. "Good morning, officer," Sarah replied politely, keeping her voice steady. "May I reach into my glove compartment for my registration?" The officer nodded stiffly. Sarah moved slowly and deliberately, pulling out her registration and then reaching for her purse to get her license. She noticed how Officer Cooper tensed up when she moved, despite her careful movements. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Cooper asked, studying her documents with unusual intensity. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah answered truthfully. She had been watching her speed and following all traffic rules. "You ran that stop sign back there," he stated firmly, though Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had come to a complete stop. "Officer, I'm certain I made a complete stop," she said calmly. "I always do, especially at that intersection." Officer Cooper's expression hardened. "Are you saying I'm lying, ma'am?" His tone became more aggressive. Sarah remained professional, though she could feel her frustration building. "Not at all, officer. I'm simply stating what I know to be true." The officer returned to his patrol car with her documents. Through her mirrors, Sarah could see him talking on his radio and typing on his computer. What should have been a 5-minute check was stretching into 15 minutes. She glanced at her watch. 8:05 a.m. The important meeting was starting to feel threateningly close. Finally, Officer Cooper returned, but now he had a thick citation book in his hand. "I'm citing you for running a stop sign, failure to signal a turn, and tinted windows beyond legal limits." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She knew these charges were false. Her windows were factory standard, and she always used her turn signals. Without arguing, she took out her phone and quietly started recording the interaction. "Officer Cooper," she said, reading his nameplate, "could you please point out which windows are illegally tinted?" The officer frowned at her phone. "Put that away," he ordered. "I have the right to record this interaction," Sarah stated firmly, her legal training kicking in, "and I'm asking for clarification about the citations." "Sign here," he said, ignoring her questions and thrusting the citation paper at her. "This is not an admission of guilt, just confirmation that you'll appear in court or pay the fines." Sarah signed the paper, her hand steady despite her internal anger. The total fines came to $875. As Officer Cooper walked away, she carefully documented the time, location, and details of the stop in her phone's notes app. She also took photos of the intersection and her car's windows. Looking at her watch again, 8:20 a.m., Sarah knew she would be late for her meeting. She pulled out her phone to call her office, but her mind was already working on something else. After years of handling corporate cases worth millions of dollars, she knew exactly how to fight this injustice. Officer Cooper and the traffic court had no idea what was coming. Sarah arrived at her office 20 minutes late for her meeting. As she walked through the glass doors of Morrison and Reynolds' law firm, her assistant James quickly approached her with a concerned look on his face. "Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson has been waiting in the conference room," James whispered, handing her a fresh cup of coffee. "He seems a bit annoyed." "Thank you, James," Sarah replied, taking a deep breath to compose herself. "Please pull the traffic surveillance footage from the corner of Oak and Madison for this morning between 7:45 and 8:15. Also, get me the contact information for the police department's records division." Before entering the conference room, Sarah quickly checked her reflection in a nearby window. Despite the stressful morning, she looked perfectly put together. Something her mother had taught her was especially important for a black woman in a predominantly white profession. The meeting with Mr. Thompson, a major client, went surprisingly well. Sarah's legal expertise and professional demeanor helped smooth over her late arrival. After 2 hours of contract negotiations, she finally returned to her private office to deal with the morning's incident. On her desk, James had already placed a folder containing the information she requested. Sarah smiled. This was why she was one of the firm's top lawyers. She knew how to build a case, and more importantly, she had a team that understood her methods. Sarah began her methodical documentation process. She typed out a detailed account of the morning's events while they were still fresh in her memory. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she recorded every word exchanged with Officer Cooper, his badge number, and the exact times of each interaction. Looking at the citations, Sarah's legal mind began picking them apart. The stop sign violation was easily disputable with traffic camera footage. The turn signal citation was absurd. She had developed the habit of using her signal religiously after years of driving in Chicago traffic. As for the window tint violation, she pulled out her car's original documentation, which proved the windows were factory standard. At 1:00 p.m. during her lunch break, Sarah drove back to the intersection. She took photos from multiple angles, showing the clear visibility at the stop sign. She also used her phone to record a video demonstrating how her turn signals worked perfectly. A few passers-by gave her curious looks, but she ignored them, focused on gathering evidence. Back at her office, Sarah received an email from James with the traffic camera footage. As she suspected, the video clearly showed her car coming to a complete stop at the intersection. She leaned back in her chair, a small smile forming on her face. Officer Cooper had picked the wrong person to harass. Sarah spent the next hour preparing a formal request for Officer Cooper's body camera footage. She knew from experience that many officers became less aggressive when they realized their actions were being recorded. She also drafted a formal complaint to the police department's internal affairs division, but saved it as a draft. She would wait to see how things played out in court first. Looking at her calendar, Sarah noticed her court date was set for 2 weeks away in Judge William Henderson's courtroom. She had never appeared before him, but she had heard stories. He was known for being tough on traffic violations and often sided with police officers. Some of her colleagues mentioned he could be dismissive, especially toward younger attorneys and minorities. "James," she called through the intercom, "can you pull all of Judge Henderson's recent traffic court rulings? I want to review his pattern of decisions." While waiting for the documents, Sarah organized her growing evidence file. She labeled everything carefully: photos, videos, car documentation, and her detailed notes. In her 15 years of corporate law, she had learned that preparation was everything. The truth was on her side, but in court, the truth needed to be presented perfectly. At the end of the workday, as Sarah packed her briefcase, she received a call from her mother. "How was your day, baby?" her mother asked. "Interesting," Sarah replied, thinking about the morning's events. "Remember how you always told me to keep my license and registration easily accessible and to stay calm during traffic stops? Did something happen?" Her mother's voice filled with concern. "Nothing I can't handle," Sarah assured her. "But I think it's time someone taught Officer Cooper and Judge Henderson that appearances can be deceiving." As she drove home that evening, Sarah noticed she was driving even more carefully than usual. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was because she knew that in 2 weeks, she would walk into that courtroom not as a scared citizen, but as a highly qualified lawyer ready to challenge a system that too often judged people by their appearance rather than their character. 2 weeks later, Sarah arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. The traffic court waiting area was already crowded with people from all walks of life. most looking nervous and defeated before their cases even began. She sat quietly in her navy blue suit, reviewing her perfectly organized evidence folder one last time. The courthouse was an old building with high ceilings and wooden benches that had seen better days. The air smelled of old papers and anxiety. Sarah noticed she was one of the few people dressed in formal business attire. Most others wore casual clothes, clearly not expecting to do more than pay their fines and leave. Officer Cooper walked in at 8:55 a.m., his uniform pressed and badge shining. He didn't recognize Sarah at first, but when their eyes met, she noticed a slight change in his expression. She gave him a polite nod, watching as he took his position near the judge's bench with other officers. All rise. The bailiff called out at exactly 9:00 a.m. the Honorable Judge William Henderson presiding. Judge Henderson entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him. He was a tall white man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His face wore the stern expression of someone who had heard every excuse in the book and believed none of them. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "We have a full docket today, so let's move quickly." Sarah watched as case after case move rapidly. Most people simply admitted guilt and agreed to pay their fines. Those who tried to argue their cases were quickly shut down by Judge Henderson's stern questioning and intimidating demeanor. He seemed almost bored, barely looking up from his papers as he handed out fines. "Case number 247, the clerk announced. Sarah Mitchell, multiple traffic violations." Sarah stood gracefully, gathering her materials. As she walked to the podium, she could feel all eyes on her. Judge Henderson barely glanced up from his papers. "Miss Mitchell, you're charged with running a stop sign, failure to signal, and illegal window tinting. How do you plead?" His tone suggested he expected another quick guilty plea. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. Judge Henderson looked up, appearing slightly annoyed at the prospect of having to spend time on a simple traffic case. "You understand these are serious violations. Officer Cooper is a respected member of our police force." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah responded professionally. "And with the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence that challenges these citations." The judge sighed heavily. "Make it quick. We have a full docket." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said, pulling out her first piece of evidence. "But before I begin, I should introduce myself properly. I'm Sarah Mitchell, senior partner at Morrison and Reynolds law firm, specializing in corporate litigation." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly above his glasses. Officer Cooper shifted uncomfortably near the bench. Several spectators sat up straighter, suddenly more interested in the proceedings. "I have here," Sarah continued smoothly, "traffic camera footage showing my complete stop at the intersection in question." She handed the footage to the bailiff. "I also have documentation proving my vehicle's windows are factory standard, well within legal limits." Judge Henderson's demeanor changed subtly as he realized this wouldn't be the usual quick traffic court case. He sat up straighter, putting on his reading glasses to examine the evidence more carefully. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice confident and clear, "I have photographs of the intersection, my vehicle's original specifications, and a time-stamped video showing my turn signals functioning perfectly. I've also obtained Officer Cooper's body camera footage through a formal request." Officer Cooper's face reddened slightly. Judge Henderson looked at him, then back at Sarah, his expression now one of careful attention rather than dismissal. "Your Honor," Sarah said, maintaining perfect composure, "I believe these citations were issued without proper cause, and I'm prepared to demonstrate why each charge should be dismissed." The other people waiting for their cases watched in amazement. Some began taking notes. Judge Henderson removed his glasses and leaned forward, his earlier boredom completely gone. "Well, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his tone notably different from earlier, "it seems we'll need to examine this evidence thoroughly." He glanced at his watch, then at the full courtroom. "Perhaps we should take a 15-minute recess before proceeding with your case." As the bailiff called for recess, Sarah remained standing, calm and prepared. She had transformed the atmosphere of the entire courtroom, and everyone knew that what was about to unfold would be far from the usual traffic court proceeding. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had completely changed. The previously half-empty benches were now filled, as word had spread through the courthouse about the corporate lawyer challenging traffic violations. Several young attorneys from other courtrooms had slipped in to watch. Judge Henderson cleared his throat. "Miss Mitchell, you may present your evidence." Sarah stood confidently at the podium, her evidence folder open before her. The morning sunlight streaming through the high courthouse windows caught her law school ring. Harvard Law, class of 2010. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah began. "I'd like to start with the traffic camera footage." She nodded to the court clerk, who played the video on the courtroom's display screen. The footage clearly showed her Mercedes coming to a complete stop, waiting 3 seconds, and then proceeding after using a turn signal. "As you can see, Your Honor, at exactly 7:48 a.m., my vehicle made a complete stop. The timestamp matches the citation exactly." Sarah's voice was clear and professional. "I'd also draw the court's attention to my turn signal, which is clearly visible in the footage." Officer Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Henderson leaned forward, studying the video with intense focus. Next, regarding the window tint violation, Sarah continued, producing a leather folder. "These are my vehicle's original manufacturing specifications from Mercedes-Benz." She handed the documents to the bailiff. "Page 3 clearly shows that all windows are factory standard, meeting every requirement of state law." Judge Henderson reviewed the documents carefully, his earlier dismissive attitude completely gone. Some people in the gallery were taking notes on their phones, impressed by Sarah's methodical presentation. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Sarah said, pulling out more evidence, "I have Officer Cooper's body camera footage, obtained through proper channels." She paused briefly. "This footage shows some concerning aspects of the traffic stop that I believe the court should review." Officer Cooper sat up straighter, his face showing the first signs of worry. Judge Henderson nodded for the video to be played. The body camera footage revealed Officer Cooper's aggressive tone and his hand repeatedly moving to his weapon, despite Sarah's calm and professional demeanor. More importantly, it showed him walking around her car but never actually checking the window tint with any measuring device. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice remaining professional but firm, "in the state of Illinois, window tint violations must be verified with a properly calibrated measurement tool. As the footage shows, no such measurement was taken." The courtroom was silent. Judge Henderson removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, clearly processing what he was seeing. Several other officers who had been waiting to present their cases had moved closer to watch. Additionally, Sarah said, pulling out one final document, "I prepared a brief citing 3 recent state Supreme Court cases addressing the burden of proof in traffic violations." She handed copies to the judge and the court clerk. "In particular, I draw your attention to Thompson v. State, which established that visual estimation alone is insufficient for window tint citations." Judge Henderson studied the brief, occasionally glancing at Officer Cooper, who was now staring at the floor. The other traffic court defendants watched in amazement as Sarah systematically dismantled each citation with evidence and legal precedent. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson finally said, his tone notably different from the beginning of the session, "I must say this is one of the most thoroughly prepared traffic court defenses I've seen in my 20 years on the bench." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "I believe in being thorough, regardless of the size of the case. Last week, I handled a multi-million-dollar corporate merger. This week, it's a traffic citation. Both deserve the same level of professional attention." The message wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Judge Henderson looked at Officer Cooper, who seemed to be wishing he could disappear into his chair. "Officer Cooper," the judge called, "do you have any response to Ms. Mitchell's evidence?" Officer Cooper stood slowly. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. I have nothing to add." Sarah remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She had transformed what was supposed to be a routine traffic court appearance into a masterclass in legal defense. The young lawyers in the gallery were still furiously taking notes. While other defendants looked at her with newfound hope and admiration, Judge Henderson sat quietly for a moment, looking over his reading glasses at the scene before him. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for his response to Sarah's powerful presentation. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the wood-paneled walls. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "In my years on this bench, I've seen thousands of traffic cases." He paused, removing his glasses. "But today, I'm seeing something else entirely." Sarah stood respectfully, her hands clasped in front of her. She noticed how the judge's earlier impatience had been replaced by something that looked like deep reflection. "Your Honor," Officer Cooper suddenly spoke up, standing nervously. "If I may." "Officer Cooper," Judge Henderson interrupted, raising his hand. "I believe Ms. Mitchell's evidence speaks for itself." The judge's tone was stern. "The footage clearly shows no proper measurement of the window tint was taken, the traffic camera confirms a complete stop, and the turn signal was clearly visible." The judge picked up Sarah's legal brief again, studying it carefully. Other officers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing themselves in Officer Cooper's position. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson continued, "before we proceed, I feel compelled to ask, how many times have you experienced similar traffic stops?" The question hung in the air. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. "Your Honor, I prefer to focus on the facts of today's case." But Judge Henderson wasn't letting it go. "In my rush to process cases efficiently this morning, I failed to give your case the proper attention it deserved." He looked around the courtroom. "I suspect I'm not the only one who made assumptions today." Several people in the gallery nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the judge's words. A young black law student, who had been watching the proceedings intently, wiped away a tear. "Your Honor," Sarah said carefully, "I believe the evidence shows these citations were issued without proper cause. However, I also believe this presents an opportunity for positive change in our system." Judge Henderson leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Please elaborate, Ms. Mitchell." "Many people who come through this courtroom don't have the legal training to challenge unfair citations," Sarah explained. "They don't know how to request body camera footage or cite legal precedents. They simply pay the fines because they feel powerless." The other defendants in the courtroom nodded in agreement. Some were taking pictures of Sarah's legal citations on their phones. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice strong but measured, "they may face assumptions about their character, their truthfulness, or their status based on their appearance." She gestured to her own professional attire. "Not everyone has the privilege of being a corporate lawyer to defend themselves." Judge Henderson's face showed growing understanding. He looked at the long line of defendants waiting for their cases to be heard, mostly minorities, many looking nervous and resigned. "The law," Sarah concluded, "should protect everyone equally, regardless of their appearance, education, or ability to present their case as thoroughly as I have today." The judge stepped back, the weight of her words visible in his expression. The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with recognition and possibility. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson finally spoke, his voice carrying new respect. "You've done more than defend against traffic citations today. You've reminded this court of its fundamental purpose, to serve justice equally to all." He shuffled through the papers on his bench, then looked directly at Officer Cooper. "Officer, would you like to make any statement before I rule?" Officer Cooper stood again, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." He glanced at Sarah, then back at the judge. "I may have been hasty in issuing these citations." Judge Henderson nodded slowly, then turned back to Sarah. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing that this moment was about more than just traffic tickets. The judge picked up his gavel, but before he could speak, he noticed something remarkable. The other officers in the courtroom were watching intently, some taking notes. The defendants waiting for their cases were sitting straighter, with hope rather than resignation on their faces. This simple traffic court session had transformed into something far more significant, a moment of truth that would ripple through the justice system in ways none of them could yet imagine. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom. Every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had stopped completely. "In the matter of these traffic citations," Judge Henderson began, his voice carrying both authority and humility, "I am prepared to make my ruling." He looked directly at Sarah, then at Officer Cooper, before addressing the entire courtroom. "First, I want to thank Ms. Mitchell," he continued. not just for her extraordinary preparation and presentation, but for forcing this court to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we administer justice. Sarah remained standing, her posture perfect but her expression softened slightly. She could feel the eyes of every defendant in the room on her. "The evidence presented today is clear and irrefutable," Judge Henderson declared. "The traffic camera footage shows a complete stop. The turn signal was properly used. And most importantly, the window tint citation was issued without proper measurement or cause." He paused, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on his bench. "Therefore, I am dismissing all citations against Ms. Mitchell with prejudice." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom, but Judge Henderson wasn't finished. "However," he continued, raising his hand for silence, "I believe this case requires more than a simple dismissal." He turned to face Officer Cooper. "Officer," approached the bench. Officer Cooper walked forward slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. His boots echoed on the wooden floor as he approached. "Officer Cooper," Judge Henderson's voice was firm, but not unkind, "I am recommending a review of your recent traffic stops for the past 6 months. I'm also mandating that you attend additional training on proper citation procedures and community relations." The officer nodded silently, his face red with embarrassment. Other police officers in the courtroom watched intently, perhaps recognizing their own potential biases. Furthermore, Judge Henderson continued, now addressing the entire court, "I am instituting new procedures in this courtroom, effective immediately." He picked up a pen and began writing. "All traffic citations involving technical measurements, such as window tint, must include documented proof of proper testing. Visual estimation alone will no longer be sufficient." Sarah's expression remained professional, but her eyes showed satisfaction. This was more than just a personal victory. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge turned back to her, "would you be willing to assist the court in developing these new procedures? Your expertise would be invaluable." "It would be my honor, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, understanding the significance of the request. The young law student who had been watching from the gallery quickly wrote down the judge's words. Several other defendants were typing on their phones, documenting this unexpected turn of events. "One more thing," Judge Henderson added, looking at the long line of people waiting for their cases to be heard. "I will be reviewing today's remaining cases with these new standards in mind." He turned to the court clerk. "Please make sure everyone waiting has access to the proper forms for requesting traffic camera footage and officer body cam videos." The clerk nodded, already pulling out stacks of forms. Hope began to replace anxiety on many faces in the crowded courtroom. As Judge Henderson prepared to move on to the next case, Sarah gathered her materials. But before she could leave the podium, the judge spoke once more. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice softer now, "I apologize for my initial dismissive attitude when you entered my courtroom. You taught this court a valuable lesson today." Sarah nodded graciously. "Thank you, Your Honor. We all have opportunities to learn and grow." As she turned to leave, several people in the gallery stood up, showing their respect. The young law student rushed forward, asking if she could interview Sarah for the law school newspaper. Other defendants approached the clerk's desk, requesting the forms for their own cases. Officer Cooper stopped Sarah before she reached the courtroom door. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I'd also owe you an apology. I made assumptions that day, assumptions I shouldn't have made." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Officer Cooper, the goal isn't to punish or shame. It's to create positive change. I trust you'll take this opportunity to do just that." As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor, she knew that what had started as a simple traffic stop had become something much more significant, a catalyst for change in a system that desperately needed it. 1 month after the landmark traffic court case, Sarah sat in her office at Morrison and Reynolds, reviewing a stack of emails and letters that had flooded in since that day. The morning sun streamed through her corner office window, illuminating the Harvard Law diploma on her wall and the fresh flowers her mother had sent to celebrate her recent community service award. The first email was from Judge Henderson's office. The new traffic court procedures, which Sarah had helped develop, were showing remarkable results. Citations across the district were down by 30%, and successful appeals had increased significantly. More importantly, the racial disparity in traffic stops have begun to decrease. Ms. Mitchell, she read aloud from a letter on her desk, "Your courage in challenging those citations gave me the strength to fight my own unfair ticket. Thank you." It was signed by Maria Rodriguez, one of the defendants who had been in the courtroom that day. Sarah added it to a growing collection of thank you notes pinned to her bulletin board. Her phone buzzed, a text from James, her assistant. "Channel 5 News is here for your interview about the Police Reform Committee." Sarah smoothed her blazer and checked her reflection. Since the traffic court incident, she had been appointed to a newly formed committee overseeing police training and community relations. What started as a simple traffic stop had sparked a movement for change throughout the city's legal system. In the building's lobby, reporter Lisa Chen waited with her camera crew. "Ms. Mitchell," Lisa began, "it's been a month since your traffic court case went viral on social media. Did you expect your stand against bias would have such a widespread impact?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "I simply presented the truth with proper evidence," she replied diplomatically. "The real change came from people like Judge Henderson and Officer Cooper being willing to acknowledge and address the underlying issues." The interview moved to Sarah's recent initiatives. She had started a free legal clinic on Saturday mornings, helping people understand their rights during traffic stops. The clinic had already assisted over 100 people, many of whom couldn't afford legal representation. "And what about Officer Cooper?" Lisa asked. "We understand he's become quite involved in community outreach." Sarah smiled, remembering the email she'd received from him last week. After completing his additional training, Officer Cooper had volunteered to lead workshops for other officers about avoiding bias in traffic stops. He was using his own experience as a teaching tool. Officer Cooper transformed a mistake into an opportunity for growth, Sarah explained to the camera. "That's the kind of change we need, not just in policies, but in people's hearts and minds." After the interview, Sarah headed to the courthouse for a meeting with Judge Henderson. The same marble halls that had intimidated so many now felt like a place of possibility. People smiled and nodded as she passed, some whispering to their friends, "That's the lawyer from the traffic case." In the judges' chambers, Sarah found not only Judge Henderson but also several other judges from neighboring districts. They wanted to implement similar reforms in their own courtrooms. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson greeted her warmly, "we've been reviewing the data from our new procedures." He handed her a report. "Complaints about unfair treatment are down 45%. Other districts are taking notice." As the meeting progressed, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was an email from Harvard Law School. They wanted her to give a guest lecture about using corporate law skills to affect social change. The subject line read, "Turning a traffic stop into a movement." Later that afternoon, Sarah visited her mother for their weekly dinner. Over her mother's famous pot roast, they discussed the changes of the past month. "Baby," her mother said, tears of pride in her eyes, "when I taught you to stay calm during traffic stops, I never imagined you'd change the whole system." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "Change happens one person at a time, Mom. Judge Henderson changed. Officer Cooper changed. And they're helping others change too." As she drove home that evening, Sarah stopped at the same intersection where Officer Cooper had pulled her over. The street sign now bore a small sticker, "Know Your Rights, free legal clinic every Saturday." A police car was parked nearby, but this time it was Officer Cooper, speaking with a group of community members about the new traffic stop procedures. He waved as Sarah passed by, and she waved back. It was a small gesture, but it represented something powerful, the possibility that justice could be fair, equal, and respectful for everyone. 6 months after the traffic court incident, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium in the city's largest conference center. The room was packed with over 500 people, judges, police officers, lawyers, community activists, and citizens from all walks of life. They had gathered for the first annual Equal Justice Conference, an event that had grown from the seeds of her traffic court case. "When I was pulled over that morning," Sarah began her keynote speech, "I never imagined it would lead to this." She gestured to the diverse crowd before her. But sometimes, the smallest moments create the biggest changes. In the front row, Sarah's mother beamed with pride. Beside her sat Judge Henderson, who had become one of the city's strongest advocates for judicial reform. Officer Cooper was there too, wearing his dress uniform, ready to lead a workshop on unbiased policing later that day. Sarah shared the latest statistics that flashed on the large screen behind her. Traffic stops in the city had decreased by 40% over the past 6 months. Successful appeal rates had risen to 65% when valid evidence was presented. Most importantly, the racial disparity in traffic citations had dropped significantly. But numbers only tell part of the story, Sarah continued, turning to a new slide. The real change is in the daily interactions between law enforcement and citizens. The screen showed photos of the free legal clinic she had started, which had now expanded to 3 locations across the city. Every Saturday, volunteer lawyers help people understand their rights and properly document their experiences. Many of these lawyers were inspired by watching Sarah's case that day in traffic court. Last week, Sarah shared with the audience, a young woman came to our clinic. She had been unfairly ticketed, just like I was, but instead of feeling helpless, she knew exactly what to do. Sarah smiled. She requested camera footage, documented everything, and presented her case clearly. The judge dismissed her tickets immediately. The audience applauded. From his seat, Judge Henderson nodded approvingly. His courtroom had become a model for fair traffic court proceedings, and judges from other cities often visited to observe his new procedures. But perhaps the most surprising change, Sarah continued, came from within the police department itself. She nodded toward Officer Cooper, who stood to be recognized. Officer Cooper could have responded to that day with anger or denial. Instead, he chose growth and transformation. The officer smiled humbly as people applauded. His training program has now been adopted by police departments in 3 neighboring states. Sarah moved away from the podium, walking closer to the audience. Change isn't just about new laws or procedures. It's about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. She shared stories of other successes. A teenager who used his phone to properly document a traffic stop, a judge who recognized her own biases and worked to overcome them, a police officer who stopped his partner from making an unfair traffic stop. These are the real victories, Sarah emphasized. Every fair interaction between police and citizens, every unbiased decision in a courtroom, every person who stands up for what's right. These are the moments that transform a system. As she concluded her speech, Sarah unveiled the conference's new initiative, a scholarship program for minority law students who committed to working in civil rights and community justice. The program would be named after her mother, honoring the woman who had taught her to stay strong and dignified in the face of prejudice. The audience rose. 6 months after the traffic court incident, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium in the city's largest conference center. The room was packed with over 500 people, judges, police officers, lawyers, community activists, and citizens from all walks of life. They had gathered for the first annual Equal Justice Conference, an event that had grown from the seeds of her traffic court case. When I was pulled over that morning, Sarah began her keynote speech. I never imagined it would lead to this. She gestured to the diverse crowd before her. But sometimes, the smallest moments create the biggest changes. In the front row, Sarah's mother beamed with pride. Beside her sat Judge Henderson, who had become one of the city's strongest advocates for judicial reform. Officer Cooper was there too, wearing his dress uniform, ready to lead a workshop on unbiased policing later that day. Sarah shared the latest statistics that flashed on the large screen behind her. Traffic stops in the city had decreased by 40% over the past 6 months. Successful appeal rates had risen to 65% when valid evidence was presented. Most importantly, the racial disparity in traffic citations had dropped significantly. But numbers only tell part of the story, Sarah continued, turning to a new slide. The real change is in the daily interactions between law enforcement and citizens. The screen showed photos of the free legal clinic she had started, which had now expanded to 3 locations across the city. Every Saturday, volunteer lawyers help people understand their rights and properly document their experiences. Many of these lawyers were inspired by watching Sarah's case that day in traffic court. Last week, Sarah shared with the audience, a young woman came to our clinic. She had been unfairly ticketed, just like I was, but instead of feeling helpless, she knew exactly what to do. Sarah smiled. She requested camera footage, documented everything, and presented her case clearly. The judge dismissed her tickets immediately. The audience applauded. From his seat, Judge Henderson nodded approvingly. His courtroom had become a model for fair traffic court proceedings, and judges from other cities often visited to observe his new procedures. But perhaps the most surprising change, Sarah continued, came from within the police department itself. She nodded toward Officer Cooper, who stood to be recognized. Officer Cooper could have responded to that day with anger or denial. Instead, he chose growth and transformation. The officer smiled humbly as people applauded. His training program has now been adopted by police departments in 3 neighboring states. Sarah moved away from the podium, walking closer to the audience. Change isn't just about new laws or procedures. It's about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. She shared stories of other successes: a teenager who used his phone to properly document a traffic stop, a judge who recognized her own biases and worked to overcome them, a police officer who stopped his partner from making an unfair traffic stop. These are the real victories, Sarah emphasized. Every fair interaction between police and citizens, every unbiased decision in a courtroom, every person who stands up for what's right. These are the moments that transform a system. As she concluded her speech, Sarah unveiled the conference's new initiative, a scholarship program for minority law students who committed to working in civil rights and community justice. The program would be named after her mother, honoring the woman who had taught her to stay strong and dignified in the face of prejudice. The audience rose.